I decided to do my project on Caller Daddy. Caller Daddy is a bold and candid podcast hosted by Alex Cooper, where she fearlessly discusses dating, relationships, and sex in a humorous and relatable manner, with a focus on empowering young women, primarily millennial and Gen Z listeners. The podcast delves into personal experiences, shares advice, and explores the modern dating landscape. Alex Cooper's no holds barred approach and willingness to openly address intimate topics have made Color Daddy a popular platform for entertaining, educating, and connecting with a diverse audience seeking unfiltered conversations about love, sex, and self discovery. Color Daddy has taken a few different steps since its beginning. It started off as primarily a more inappropriate podcast, I would say, for younger listeners, and has now shifted into becoming a very large platform for empowering women. She tends to focus on choosing people that are outcasted by society, whether that be through a recent scandal or especially regarding anything involving sexual assault or misconduct within Hollywood, breakups, and that sort of thing. She tends to go towards a person to interview that will give her views and that her viewers or listeners will connect with. Alex Cooper's listeners, their demographic is normally young adult audience skewing towards millennial and Gen Z. But there are a few stragglers here and there, I will say. The listenership is likely to be predominantly female, given the focus on dating and relationships from a female perspective. The location of our listeners would probably span across English speaking regions, with a significant following in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom and Australia. I would argue a lot of her listeners now, so to speak, are primarily in the West Coast. I don't exactly know why, but I think the vibe that she speaks about and the issues that she discusses and the celebrities that she endorses on her podcast are normally based on Los Angeles drama. The interests of the audience, though, they're interested in modern dating, culture, relationships, and candid discussions on sexuality and empowerment, and also tend to be very focused on pop culture. Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy podcast has developed a comprehensive content strategy that combines entertainment, relatability, and empowerment to resonate with its audience. The strategy centers on open and candid discussions about dating, relationships, which I've already discussed, but I wanted to highlight a few key components in their specificity and go over what she does to make her podcast so relevant and so popular in the realm of social media today, where anyone can become famous overnight and then it can be taken away. And her relevancy has been maintained since 2017. At the core of the content strategy is candid conversations that address intimate and often taboo topics without hesitation. Alex Cooper's willingness to share her personal experiences, both humorous and challenging, creates a relatable and empathetic atmosphere, making listeners feel understood and less alone in their own experiences. The second key content strategy she utilizes is empowerment and self expression. The podcast aims to empower its audience by embracing sexuality and individuality without judgment. By addressing subjects that are often stigmatized, the podcast encourages listeners to confidently express themselves and make informed decisions about their relationships and sexual health. The third aspect of her content strategy, which happens to be my favorite, is the humor and entertainment. A key element of the content strategy is humor. Alex Cooper's witty and lighthearted approach injects entertainment into even the most serious topics, creating an engaging and enjoyable listening experience. She does this in a way that makes it feel not forced and that the listener almost feels like they're her friend, which I really appreciate, and I know other girls my age really appreciate it because she does discuss topics that can be uncomfortable and relatable at the same time. And so I think adding humor into the mix just sets her apart in so many regards. Piggybacking off of the humor aspect of the content strategy, she introduces real life stories and anecdotes from both Alex Cooper's own experiences and from listeners who share their anecdotes. This authenticity contributes to a sense of authenticity and relatability, reinforcing the idea that everyone faces similar challenges and joys in the realm of dating and relationships. The fifth aspect of her content strategy is relationship advice and tips. While the discussions are candid and entertaining, the podcast also provides practical relationship advice and tips. Listeners can gain insight into communication, boundaries, and navigating complex situations, contributing to their personal growth and well being. The sixth aspect is episode segments and themes, which I think she hits them the nail on the head on this one every single time. The podcast often features reoccurring episodes and segments and themes that explore specific aspects of dating and relationships. These segments add structure to the content and allow for in depth exploration of different topics, ensuring variety while maintaining the core focus. Call Her Daddy would not be Call Her Daddy if not for the engagement of her fans. So, another aspect of her content strategy is the interactive engagement. Engagement with the audience is promoted through interactive elements such as listener Q&A sessions, polls, and shoutouts. This allows a sense of community where listeners feel actively involved in the podcast's content and direction, and what she gives her fans and listeners an opportunity to be a part of it, whereas just handing off a podcast without any of their opinions, which I think is very intelligent and a very good move on her end. As I mentioned before, the shift that she recently has undergone, which now is a very large aspect of her podcast and a huge part of her content strategy, is timely and trend relevant discussions. The content strategy incorporates timely discussions on trending topics related to dating and relationships, ensuring that the podcast remains relevant and resonates with current cultural conversations, which I had mentioned before. Specifically, the handpicked celebrities that she chooses to interview on her podcast or situations she specifically chooses to discuss from her point of view related to what is going on in pop culture today is a massive aspect of her podcast now. The Call Her Daddy podcast does something very well, which includes its posts and content. The podcast's Instagram presence reflects its content strategy. Posts include eye-catching promotional graphics like the one seen on the screen right now, episode quotes, memes, and candid photos of Alex. Content is designed to resonate with the audience's experiences and emotions. For example, if she's discussing something very pressing or something very serious, a video on Instagram would be posted and it would be cut off right when the audience would be able to discover what was discussed in that podcast episode, which ultimately gives more interaction to her podcast because those followers are forced to go listen to the podcast to figure out what exactly was being discussed. She also uses hashtags. Commonly used hashtags include dating advice, relationship goals, sex positivity, etc. Her color scheme and aesthetic, it's very vibrant, bold, reflecting the podcast's fearless approach. The aesthetic is modern, relatable, and empowering, aligning with the podcast messaging. As you can see, a lot of pink is thrown into the mix, and which is intentional because her merchandise is also pink as well, and her font remains the same on certain things. She does collaborations, obviously, as seen in this photo. While Alex is the focal point, occasional collaborations with guests and influencers introduce diverse perspectives. Moderation and engagement. Posts and comments are likely moderated to maintain a respectful and positive environment. Alex Cooper and her team engage with followers through comments, direct messages, and interactive features like polls and Q&A sessions. I would like it to be noted that they do offline, not specifically on her podcast, but on her Instagram, they do filter out if there's a ton of hate comments being sent or if fans are bullying one another or anything that would tear another person down. They do like to filter that, which I think is very impressive. It would help her engagement almost if there was hate in the comments, but she decides to filter those out, her and her team. Alex Cooper currently has two different accounts. She has her personal account, which she decided to enable the new Instagram feature where you can disable all like counts and comments. So ultimately, she's posting blank photos, so her fans can't really engage in what she posts on her own account. Whereas the Call Her Daddy podcast, and ultimately it's now a company in it of itself, that has 2 million followers. And just scrolling through, she also disabled the like count on this, but I would assume with 2 million followers that she would get anywhere between 100,000 and 300,000 likes per post, depending on how popular the post is and if it's being sent around. Or if she has a celebrity on the podcast recently and would post something like what is on the screen, she would have a lot more engagement on those posts because Gwyneth Paltrow is very popular. In recent months, Alex Cooper has made incredible strides in marketing and honestly growing her platform into something that's more mature and something that people can look to when they want entertainment or honestly just advice. Whereas in the beginning, it was pretty much about sexual relationships and how to navigate the male species, whereas now it's much more focused on female empowerment and such. And so to do so, which would make her platform gain exceptional engagement, would be if she invited her ex co host, Sophia Franklin, who started the podcast with Alex when it was originally funded by Barstool Sports. It was a Dave Portnoy funded podcast. The two of them were best friends, inseparable, and a massive scandal went down regarding a business deal in which Sophia was coined as a massive villain. And I think in order to show that women protect other women and women have each other's back, Alex, for a long time, let the internet drag through Sophia's reputation and ultimately tear her down. And I think a massive maturity step would be for Alex to extend an invite to Sophia and talk it through, not in a way that things need to be discussed out publicly, but more so in a way to wave a white flag and basically move forward so that the two of them don't have to be at odds at each other. And I know personal things happen between one another, but when you're put into such a massive platform and such a massive following, it is kind of hypocritical to be behind the scenes saying that you want to empower all these women, but someone that was once your best friend made a big mistake, but you're now not letting her reconcile. And I think every fan of Call Her Daddy would be very keen on listening to that episode. And so I would be anxious to see if that's her next step. Yeah.